So, what we're going to talk about this morning, and for the next 2 mornings at least, are hallucinations real? That's the jazzy title. The alternative title is sensitivity, clairvoyance, insight, and spiritual sight. Now, the topic or the title is probably the most jazzy thing about the entire talk. In fact, the entire 3 talks. What it is that this is meant for a very introductory group, and all of you are well beyond it, so for most of you it will be review. Now this is going to go very, very slowly, painfully slowly, and we're going to look at just the salient features of the subject and nothing more. This is a subject about which one cannot speak or write with complete clarity unless the person communicating is clairvoyant and unless the communicants are clairvoyant. Now, if I were completely clairvoyant and you folks were clairvoyant, it would be much different. The talk would be. It would be both easier and it would be harder. It would be easier because everyone would have full access to the information at which we were pointed, and it would be harder because one would have to overcome all of the assumptions and illusions and misconceptions that each of us would have. If all of us were clairvoyant, it would be more like an art class. In an art class, the instructor helps you to train your visual perception so that you can see things, and because we often don't see things, and everyone assumes they have knowledge of perception, and that's a little difficult. What we're going to do is we're going to assume that none of us is clairvoyant. And if anyone is clairvoyant, they can just look on it as an intellectual kind of review. Now, clairvoyance is one of the subjects that is fraught with misinformation, mistaken notions, illusions, all kinds of opinions, and many similar difficulties. So, for this talk, what we're going to do is going to clear up some of those issues, or at least define them, even if everyone doesn't agree. We're not going to combat or ridicule other views. We're just going to talk about things as clearly as possible. It's a very difficult subject because there are so many phenomena experienced through so many different techniques, and the technique can affect the perception that it's impossible to address most of the phenomena that people experience. So it's a difficult kind of thing. Now, the inner worlds themselves are very complex. There are realms and sub-realms and many unusual phenomena, some of which are very transient, that it's hard to keep up with everything. It's hard to address each little thing that occurs. This is one of the reasons why one who wishes to investigate the inner worlds must have very exacting self-control, and why one must have very intimate self-knowledge. We are the instrument. We are the laboratory, and we're looking through our own personality, and on top of that, even the things that we are looking at are equally sensitive and equally difficult of observation. As we've said several times in the course of these talks, it's all about subtlety. The more subtle we become, the more likely we are to be able to deal with inner things. There are parallels between the physical world and the inner worlds. For example, if we take a walk through a forest, we might see lovely trees and leaves, maybe a few animals, bushes, things like that. If we're very careful, and if we take instruments along, we might see micro-environments and microbes. And if we do an exhaustive study of the forest, we would recognize a very vast and sensitive chain of life that went all the way from the mineral through the microbe, plants, and the animals, right up to our own being. It's a very big, big thing. If we look at the forest with different eyes, for example, we would see that each tree and each plant had an amazing sensitivity to light. And we would probably be moved like an artist to see how growth habits and activities of plants are a wonder with relation to light. If you look at each tree has its own geometric philosophy for getting its leaves to the light. I have a friend who is a chemist, a soils chemist, and I mentioned this to him, and he wrote a lovely, I should have brought some copies of it along. He wrote a lovely little treatise called The Trees of Plato, in which he studies the structure of trees and their geometric shape and how they bend their branches to get at light. And he goes into the kind of wood they have to produce to follow a given philosophy. And it's really a nice little thing. It's nice to see when you start somebody with an idea and they can take it and really run with it. We have to develop a similar sensitivity. We have to develop a very refined discernment and a trained observational skill to be aware of the spiritual environment as it is in the world outside us and in our own being. What we'll try to do in this talk is to address central features of doing just that. And we won't go into all of the minutiae, except we'll take a few examples as we go along the way. The talk will be very short. The next three will probably be very short. It will be no longer than 3 hours and 15 minutes. And what we're going to do is we're going to treat it like it mildly as though it were a philosophy of science or a philosophy of technology, because we're treating our bodies and the world in a scientific way. Now, in the last 3 talks before this talk, we've been studying in a mild or shallow manner cycles that are divided between 2 principal streams of conscious activity. Extroversion, in which we go from deep in the spirit out into the external world, and introversion, wherein we take the experience of the external world and carry it into the spirit so that the spirit can gain from the experience. We've actually gone into how we live our way into the world by thinking forward or by looking forward, and how we remove ourselves from the world by looking backward. These 2 streams of spiritual activity are active within each level of existence and between every level of existence. And so they lend themselves to the study of clairvoyance, which is what we're going to be doing now. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. The Rosicrucian philosophy has an almost self-evidently obvious principle about our relationship to spiritual worlds. It's very simple. And that is, before any being can experience a world in its own being, that being must have evolved a vehicle of consciousness made up of the stuff that it is experiencing. It's like saying that before we can really be aware of the physical world, we have to have a dense physical body. And it may take millions and millions and millions of years to produce a dense physical body of the sensitivity, complexity, and wonderful workings like our physical body is. To go even a step further, our consciousness in any given world is very much improved when we have perceptive organs so that we are fully conscious in those worlds. So we couldn't function in the chemical region of the physical world unless we immersed our being in that world and experienced it long enough to produce bodies. Some beings are just beginning that activity now. We have single-celled animals, we have things like lichens, or even more so the chelates. The chelates that live off of eating stone in the process called chelation. So the more we experience a realm, and the more we adapt to that realm and create within that realm, the better we know it. Now, there are some peculiarities of this principle that aren't immediately apparent. And some of those peculiarities are the source of a lot of misunderstanding. For example, an angel, though of a higher grade of consciousness than ourselves, has not had the evolution in the chemical region of the physical world. And as a consequence, an angel cannot build a body like this body that we have and spend most of our time in. It's just not possible. They haven't had that. They don't know that. Now, if an angel did immerse its being and associate its consciousness with the chemical region for a long, long time, perhaps many millions of years, it could learn to expropriate the material of the chemical region and gradually learn how to build bodies. It's the same spirit. It should be able to do the same things we do, but it has to have the experience. This is why talks like this are difficult, because talks like this are second-hand. And in spiritual things, first-hand, immediate experience is worth much, much more than second-hand experience. So in the Bible, when Mary is visited by an angel, or David consults with an archangel, that angel and that archangel are not in dense physical bodies. Now, an angel may be able to condense the ethers of its etheric body, which it does have, so that it appears like a dense physical body, and they may even shape it like a human body, but it is not flesh and bones. This we know of. There are folk statements about this. It is said that angels and Lucifers cast no shadow because they are made out of something which light passes through that does not have the opacity of the matter of the chemical region. There are some disincarnate entities that can make themselves appear, some earthbound and malicious, others benign and helpful. But if there's no shadow, it's not a physical body. Now, it's a peculiar thing, but something of a very low grade of consciousness. Something like an amoeba, or a paramecium, or a euglena or some kind of very primitive animal like that, it can do what an angel can't do. It can make a physical body. That's one of the wonders of the world that we live in. So in a one way, an amoeba and a human are equal in having physical experience. However, the human has had a much longer and much perfected experience of the physical world, and that's for a number of reasons. It's because we have a longer evolution, and we have the spirit actually right in the dense physical working directly in this plane. That's important. We also have waking self-consciousness. We can look as we wish to look, and we are not directed by spiritual beings outside of us as the amoeba is. Now, despite that vast difference in consciousness and in manifest evolutionary refinement, the amoebic body and the human body use the principle of introversion and extroversion that we have been speaking of day by day. That means that each can internalize an awareness or an experience of the external physical world, the physical macrocosm. And each can externalize a response, usually an action or emotion, so that in relation to things outside of us, both we and the amoeba can relate, we can experience. In the highly sophisticated human body, we have sensory nerves. We have specialized nerves like the optic nerve or the auditory nerve, as well as the spinal sensory nerves. We have what is called an afferent nervous system. And when we take action, we have an efferent nervous system. So we're very, very sophisticated. Whereas the amoeba has neither. In the amoeba, it just moves its whole body. It sort of globs around and it doesn't have all of that development. Now, in the human physical body, we have developed sense organs. And we have that neuromuscular system which can do wondrous, wondrous things, such as play violin. I don't know if you've ever tried to play a violin. It's very difficult. You're lucky to even get a sound out at all. And people work years and years and years to get a very delicate, they can make exactly the sound that they want so the instrument almost talks. Now what we're trying to do is we're trying to differentiate various grades of clairvoyance, insight, and spiritual sight. Clairvoyance literally means clear seeing. Generically, it means clear perception. We'll have much more to say about that along the way. These are very slow talks, but for now, we can say that the human being is in the dense chemical region of the material world. We are physically clairvoyant relative to the amoeba. That is to say, we have organs of perception that we can clearly see in the dense physical world. The amoeba may have some rough sense of warmth, or it may have some rough sense of a food particle passing by, but it does not have a specific organ of perception. We do. So you can all go home and tell your friends, I'm clairvoyant. I'm clairvoyant in the physical world, because that's what the reality is. Now, insight, I didn't put all of the other title up here. Insight, on the other hand, is something very different than clairvoyance. Insight means inner awakening to the truth of something. Insight is a spiritual experience. Insight is wonderful. I live and die by insight. Insight is a transcendental experience. It comes from beyond the fourfold bodies. It comes in the threefold spirit. It is a spiritual knowing. All insight is a moment of truth, a moment of experience in meaning, the meaning that is behind all of the phenomena in all of the phenomenal worlds, be it a thought, be it an emotion, be it a movement, or be it a physical object. We can have insight about that. And in most cases, insight is adequate. That if we experience something and then get an insight about it, that is truth. Everything that is in the phenomenal worlds is a manifestation and a reflection of something from the divine spiritual worlds. And so if we have an intuitive insight into something, that is truth. Now, when by the process of inner work, inner self-control, we bring the spirit to bear on the perceptive process in such a way that insight is aligned with perception in any world, you then have spiritual sight. So spiritual sight is bringing the spirit with its knowing to bear on a perceptive process. So, if a human is awake, to the spirit can give its attention to anything that we're doing externally. This means that we can have a closed circuit, that in the process of taking things from the external world in and from the internal worlds out, we can have a complete closed circuit, and that's what we call spiritual sight. Often we look at things and we don't bring the intuitive insight to bear, and as a consequence, things go in and they don't register in such a way that we know the spiritual truth of it. Now, this happens when we do this. Our perception is not a passive activity. If you take the physiology of perception and the psychology of perception as it's taught in the universities, the physiology is such that our sensory organs are considered passive. That is, they are receptors, and they receive things from without, and that's it. However, if we are bringing our consciousness, if we're bringing our attention to bear on something that we are perceiving, it becomes an active process. It's not a passive process. There is a passive element to it, but there is an active element. And so what we're talking about as spiritual perception or spiritual sight is when there is the active and passive agency working together. And that produces a clear or a closed circuit. Now this is something that we experience every day. There is a spiritual sight that relates to the physical world. So not only are we clairvoyant in the physical world, we can have spiritual sight in the external world. That is when we look at something attentively and we discover what it means. When we look at something and we say that look on somebody's face means they're very sad about something, or they're angry with us for something we've done or something like that, that is a form of spiritual sight. And that can be taken to great lengths, to great depths. We can understand the external world quite a bit that way. It doesn't even have to always be an insight on that part of knowledge. If we see something and we see how beautiful it is, and there is that moment of grace or we appreciate the beauty of something in the external world, that also is a kind of spiritual sight. So we don't have to, there is, when people are talking about clairvoyance and spiritual sight, there is a sort of elitism around it. And there are the haves and the have-nots. And those are very bad attitudes to cultivate. The better attitude is that it's available and open to all of us, and the only difference is some people have taken all the trouble, all of the effort to cultivate themselves and to be sensitive and to be deliberately experiencing the world in this fashion. Now, I can say all these things, and people can feel like they're not left out, but still, everybody that's in this room wants something more. They want to know about the other worlds. They want to be in touch with what's behind it all. They want to, they want to really know what's going on. So we have to look a little more. This is where things get a little bit tedious for a few minutes. Now, if we note what we've been talking about for the last few minutes, we can note, for example, that the perceptive process is a tripartite process. There are three parts to it. First, there is the seer. That is the being who is doing the perceiving in whatever world. That perceiver is called the subject. Then there is the object, that which is seen, the perceived thing, or the perceived state is the object. And the third member of the tripartite process is the seeing itself, is the process. Now, different people have lined up on different sides of the issue as to what is the more important factor in perception. And consequently, we have, as you might expect, an objectivist who is most likely an extrovert by psychology, is likely to say the good taste is in the apple pie. That is the reality of the perception. If the right lemons weren't in the lemon pie, it wouldn't taste good. So the reality is outside of us. I'm sure we all recognize that. Then there is the subjectivist. And the subjectivist says, no, the good taste is in me. It's not in the pie. I don't care. You can have the greatest pie in the world, and if a person can't taste it, it isn't going to taste good. So there are very distinct views about the nature of reality. And of course, there are some people that say they are called phenomenologists. And they would say that the good taste is only in the moment of eating the pie. Even the memory is really not the good taste, or the anticipation is not the good taste, that the experience is only in the living process. Yes, there is something that's latent in the subject, and there's something that is latent in the object, but there has to be the process, so that subject and object come together. In the moment that the process is discontinued, the good taste is lost. These are all interesting views. Buddha went a step further. In what is called the Surangamba Sutra, which is probably one of the most important works on perception ever written, it's an exceedingly insightful thing. You can get copies of it, it's fairly easy to get. He says something to the effect, when one is attentive as the seer, and one is attentive to the object, and one is watching the process as it takes place, there is a fourth overall experience that sees the object and the subject and the ongoing as a total reality. That's a very big thing. That's complete seership. We've all had mild experiences of that. We have it every time that we're in a dream. And when we're in a dream and we're doing something in a dream, but yet we're watching what we're doing in the dream at the same time, and we see what we're interacting with in the dream, we have that total kind of experience. And since most dreams are a slightly askew experience of the desire world, that is the beginning of what it is like to have the total perception of the seer, the seen, the seeing, and the totality all at the same time. Obviously, we're in it for all the marbles. We're looking for this total kind of consciousness, and we'll continue to work our way toward that slowly. Now, the subjectivist would say that it is the state of the seer that counts. Perceptive instruments, sensitive instruments are what are important. And it doesn't make any difference what the object is. To develop, we have to work on our instruments. In terms of the higher spiritual worlds, there's a good deal of truth to this. Because with spiritual vision, we're always looking through our own psychology. And if our psychology, if we don't have a unity to our psychology, and if we have all kinds of distracting, pussy desires and things like that, it's very difficult to see what is in the external world, because even in the desire world externally, because we're looking through our own stuff, and what might be a object that is right within the lens itself would appear as though it's in the external world. Big danger. But there's also a danger to subjectivism itself. You can get so caught up in yourself, you can get so caught up in the perception that you eventually live in a fantasy world, a solipsism that really doesn't have much regard for the external world. Now, the objectivist would say that the external world is a standard. And the only way that you're going to understand the external world, or to get to the reality, in fact, all reality is external for the objectivist, is that the subject has to let go of itself and it has to attune itself to something outer. Otherwise, the subject is worthless and it's just a matter of vanity. And you're just fussing about yourself, and you're not being real. People like that are usually tough-minded. Now, there's a good deal to be said for that, because that's precisely what science and technology do. They relate us to the material world in that way that everything is in the materials that we work with, and we develop devices to relate to the things that are totally external. Now, in terms of the perception of the higher spiritual worlds through one's microcosmic being, that certainly is true. We must attune ourselves to the macrocosmic spiritual worlds to see them. The danger of objectivism is that it lacks the establishment of character. And it doesn't have respect. And it defers everything to the external world, and that deferent kind of consciousness makes a person not responsible, at least not responsible to self. This is what's happening right now in genetic science. In genetic science, what is happening is people are fascinated with what happens in the world of genetics, and they're not thinking about the conclusions of what they're doing and what it means for the world. Some people think it's a great thing to have strawberries that have fish genes in them so that they can make a few bucks here and there. You know, it's a hard thing to deal with. No doubt, phenomenal phenomenological reality as one experiences is true just by virtue of its being. Conscious living, being conscious of our life as we're going on, is the heart of the whole spiritual quest. Our life comes alive when we are aware of the process and of everything we're doing in the process. There are some people that teach that one of the easiest ways to unfold clairvoyance of the higher worlds is to do everything with complete self-consciousness. That is, if I move my hand like that, I should be completely self-conscious of the fact that I'm doing it. If I put a stamp on an envelope, I do that with complete self-consciousness, and that if one has that kind of self-consciousness applied to each and every little thing that is watching all the time, that produces a waking spiritual clairvoyance. Now, it should be clear that if everything is in the experience and not anchored in either the object or the subject or both, but everything is just in the experience, one has a rather dicey kind of living. Things are a bit chancy. You're living in something that's flowing on all the time, and it's sort of like a fish living in the river, but actually being part of the river, and you're not, it's hard to be objective in that. It's hard to come to conclusions in that kind of a thing. Now, it should be clear that what we're saying is that the truth is in the subject, in the object, and in the experience. All are important. Now, a means of spiritual perception can be founded in each one of these. We've talked about that fairly clearly now. And there is a value to each. And each plays a valid role in our lives. And if we wish to be spiritual seers, it's important that we take an inventory of ourselves to see whether we are too biased toward the subject or whether we're too biased toward the object, because the whole process of seeing depends on that balance. As we've said, there are advantages and drawbacks to all of them. Let's pass over something here. We're talking about trying to establish a valid path to seership, and we're saying that all three should be part of a valid path. Now, in Rosicrucian Christian mysticism, like in most mysticism, the initial emphasis is placed on the subject, at least in the beginning. So, the Rosicrucian philosophy teaches that the work is done on the subject to begin with. There are several reasons for this. One is that only when we have established a liaison with the divinity within ourselves can we know anything. Only when we have the truth clearly functioning inside of ourselves through testable intuition can we have reliable knowledge. A second reason, while experience is an end for our existence, recreational phenomena or phenomena themselves are just not enough. We have to have a sense of purpose. And the sense of purpose does not come merely in the phenomenological seeing or in the object. The sense of purpose is founded in the divinity within the subject. Another reason is that the subject, our personality, and our spirituality is responsible. It's not just a chancy matter. We are responsible for what we do. And everything that we do and everything that we neglect doing is what is going to make our character what it is to be. We're responsible for ourselves. That's an important thing. It is the subject and our personality and spirituality that is the instrument. And we can do something about ourself. We can make something of ourself. The external world, yes, we can do something with the external world, but you haven't really done something with the external world, or it is meaningless unless you have done something with yourself. So it is our spiritual responsibility. It is our instrument of investigation. You know, like we can adapt to reality, whereas reality has a much harder time adapting to us. What? Yes, exactly. It is in its own right. It's also another reason why we begin by working on the subject, is because it is in our being that we are imperfect, and in some cases error-prone, and even worse, sinful. And that we can't possibly hope to perceive any truth in anything unless we clean up our act. It's just not going to happen. It is the character, our character, that determines which objects we are attracted to. And if we have a small character, we'll only be attracted to small things. In that regard, we would be no different than the amoeba, which only knows this as little particles of food passing by, and it knows nothing about the greater world. And if we hope to understand the grand, great spiritual purposes and the things that are happening with evolutionary or astronomical dimensions, we have to have a larger consciousness. And we can only get that by waking up the totality of our own being. Attentiveness and control are essential for safe driving. In fact, they're legal responsibilities. Our vehicles, when we are in a car, is just like when we're in our spiritual vehicles. We must be in control and we must be attentive. Anytime we strike another vehicle from the rear, we're always at fault. It means that we weren't attentive to what was right in front of us. And it's the same thing with spiritual perception and with soul travel. Doing something with ourselves and with relation to the external world is what it's all about. Now, even though the Rosicrucian philosophy teaches that the greatest work must begin with the subject, the Rosicrucian philosophy is not subjectivist. That would be totally foolish. It does teach that the altar of truth is within, and that the best place to begin the spiritual quest is within. But it is not done for self in a personal sense. It is done for the glory of God, and it's done for the sake of others. Other things are in this, other things are participating, and we have the desire to share and are willing to set aside what is actually a fogging thing of our own egoism in order to look outward to others. So to that extent, when we have a care about other beings outside of us, that brings in the objectivity. Now, as far as the receptivity or the ability to begin to see the inner worlds, Rosicrucian mysticism has one simple explanation for that receptivity. It can be said in one word. Receptive capacity is due to sensitivity. Sensitivity is what it's all about. In fact, Carl Jung, after spending his entire life studying neurosis, came to the conclusion that it wasn't a result of or another. It wasn't a result of traumatic experiences or anything like that. It came to the conclusion that neurosis was a consequence of sensitivity, and that some people having an experience that might be traumatic and that might bend the personality to a neurosis for the rest of the life, for another person it wouldn't affect them because they weren't sensitive. So, sensitivity is fundamental to all perceptive phenomena and to the psychology that results from them. In simple, what we are trying to say with regard to sensitivity and perception is that two things are necessary for the perception. That is, a conscious perceiver and a sensitive vehicle for receptivity and conveyance of experience. Yeah, it's good to check up on me because I don't always get things set up right. The vehicle of receptivity has several factors that make for wholesome sensitivity and receptivity. One is the quality of the vehicles. If we have poor eyes to begin with, or if we have poor sense organs, or if we have unclear or perverted desires in our desire body, the quality of our vehicles is going to be impedimental to the experience. A second factor is the attunement of the conscious perceptor to the vehicles. Are we paying attention? Do we have loving care about what we're doing? We can't possibly hope to see things in the inner world where love is far more prevalent than it is here if we are not lovingly attuned to what we're seeing. The very nature of the world is true. The quality of light, the intensity of our desire, the stuff of the world around us is important. Another factor in sensitivity is change. In some regard, all self-conscious awareness is a matter of change. Animals know this. That's why the opossum lives. Or if you walk in a forest, every animal in that forest will be sitting still because they know that you will not be aware of them, you will not see them if they don't move. The moment they move, the moment there is a change, there is consciousness. All consciousness has something to do with movement or with change. Now we're going to be speaking a lot about sensitivity, but some of the statements we're going to make are going to be very broad, and some of them are going to be very specific. Now, even though sensitivity is necessary and essential for developing clairvoyant perception or any kind of perception, the primary emphasis for us in developing clairvoyance is not placed on sensitivity. We do not work first and foremost on sensitivity. Very important. Balanced development and control are much more important than sensitivity. Positive sensitivity is a byproduct. It's a consequence of developing self-control. For example, if you watch an Indian musician, for example, these are people that work on self-control in music as much as 14 hours a day for 10 or 15 years before they even have something like a recital. In all of their life, they work on that self-control, and you can see it in them that the more self-control they develop, the more nuance they have in putting their voice into things or in getting subtle inflections out of the instrument or playing an instrument. I happen to love the sarangi, and there are probably only 4 sarangi players left in the world. And of all of the instruments in Indian music are extremely sensitive instruments, but the sarangi is made for singing with. It has a whole bunch of drones, and it's called the instrument of 1,000 voices. I should have brought some sarangi music along. It's really very interesting to listen to. But at any rate, we do not try to develop sensitivity. First, we develop self-control, and sensitivity is a byproduct. Let's look at one of the triads for opening up spiritual vision. We talked about it in one of the Shakespeare talks. There are, let's put the eye in there, the eye in the triangle that sees all. At one vertex, we have sensitivity. At another, we have knowledge. At another, we have will. Each of these offers part of seership. If these factors are not balanced, we have no vision. We have no clairvoyance, or if we do have a vision, it is extremely distorted. If a person is very highly sensitive, and that's all they have, and the other 2 points of the triangle are neglected, you have someone who's helpless. You have someone who experiences all kinds of things, but doesn't know what they mean, and they can't do anything about it. There are people that have developed sensitivity in that regard, and they think they are advanced. Really not. They're pathetic. It's very sad to see such a person that has put themselves into that kind of position. If a person has knowledge, you have something like a pedant. They know this, and they know that, and they know that, and they know that, and they know that, and they'll talk for hours with knowledge, and it's even more boring than my talks are, because they're so dry they put you to sleep. Part of the reason for that is they don't have the sensitivity to make it relevant, nor do they have the gumption to put some life into it. Now, if a person has will, but lacks sensitivity and knowledge, that person may be able to effect wonders. But they're ruthless, they're insensitive, and they don't care about the consequences of their deeds, and hence they're forceful and arbitrary. Now, most people we know are not specialists in one vortex only. Most people we know have 2 of the vortices active and are weak in the 3rd. And the most common one is that a lot of people are sensitive and they know what it means, but very few people have taken the ability to bring the power of the Spirit through the will to be able to act on what they know. We find most people coming out of college that have a lot of knowledge, and they're sensitive to a lot of things, but they don't have a can-do attitude. So it is only when all 3 of these factors are balanced that we can see. It doesn't depend on evolutionary level. You can come to seership at any evolutionary level if you have all 3 balanced. I'll give you an example. When I first got on the spiritual path, I had a small mystical experience, and I had read the Cosmic Conception, and I had just finished a solid year in college. I went all year I went to both semesters, and I went to summer school, and I read the Cosmo, and it was exciting to me, and I wanted to run down the street saying, now I know what Odysseus was all about, and now I know what Aeneas was all about, and I was ready to take the final exam. I was in that kind of mode. And I had a very serious illness, and I was close to death. And so I had a hospital bill to work off. And so I worked for the Borden's Milk Company in Tucson, Arizona. I looked at it at that time as I was taking care of the secret cow. It was a funny thing. And my job every day was late in the afternoon when the milkmen came in from their routes. I washed the milk trucks. That was my big job, because Borden's was big on having shiny, clean trucks every day, and they thought people will think that the milk is wholesome. Now, in the break room at the milk company, when the drivers came in, they would talk about various things. They would talk about prize fights. They'd talk about sex. There wasn't much talk about drinking and things like that. But there was one particular milkman. I don't even remember his name anymore, but he was different than all of the rest. And he had a very big route, but it didn't take him any longer. And he had an ability. He said, I save my time and I save my steps. And he said, before I leave the truck to walk to the door, I say to myself, I wonder if Mrs. Brown needs some whipping cream today, or something, or does she need something extra today? And the intuition would say, yes, she wants a pint of whipping cream. So he trusted the intuition, grabbed the whipping cream along with her regular order of milk, went to the door, put the things down, picked up the bottles, came back to the truck, and he didn't have to go pick up the regular order, take it to the door, and then find that there's a note there saying, I need a pint of whipping cream this morning, because he was ahead of it. He intuitively knew, and therefore when other people had to make 2 trips, he made only 1. And I was envious of him. This man didn't know anything about the Cosmo-conception. He didn't know anything about Madame Blavatsky, but yet he was able to do this, and I wasn't. And by studying him, and studying him very carefully, he was a very deeply Christian man, and he believed in service. Now, he was only of average intelligence and average knowledge, and he was only of average sensitivity, and had no more willpower than other people, but he had them in balance. When he was a balanced individual, something wasn't pulling him off base, or he wasn't deficient in something, and because he had balance, he could see through. Within his own vehicle, he was in a set way. Now, of these 3 factors, sensitivity is the easiest one to attain to, and the will and control is the most difficult. That's why we find so few people who have that kind of control and who have that kind of will. Despite this, there are still all kinds of groups that push greater sensitivity. I'm sure you've heard of the sensitivity and training groups. And most of the sensitivity, especially when it gets out of balance, is unwholesome sensitivity. If a sensitivity is a byproduct of living a total life, it is positive sensitivity. There are other kinds of sensitivity that are not wholesome. For example, if we have a sunburn, we're really sensitive, but that's unhealthy. We're not going to give ourselves a sunburn in order to be healthy. Then there is a sensitivity that some people actually promote. They sand the tips of their fingers so that they can feel the tumblers fall when they crack safes. Now that's a heightened sensitivity, but it's destructive. Instead of maintaining and instead of building the body, they're breaking the body down by destructive sensitivity. Similarly, drugs and all kinds of extremist practices can produce unwholesome sensitivities, and those sensitivities are not only devastating to the physical body, they're dangerous. You get yourself into all kinds of inner world problems with them. If you have to be out of control in order to experience something, there are beings around that know that you're promoting being out of control, and in so doing, they know that you are vulnerable. So we always have to, in this triad, or any part of this triad, we have to apply intuition and good, sound judgment. Because what we do and what we don't do, you'll hear me say this almost every day, is what we become. What we do and what we don't do is what we become. Right now, this instant is determining the future. I have friends that are contradictory. I have one friend that is a retired architect. He's a very bright man. He has studied theosophy and the Rosicrucian philosophy for years and years and years. And he's willing to take hallucinogenic mushrooms or to take LSD or something like that in order to see the inner world. He's up in his 70s and he said, I want to see the inner world before I go. And so I say to him, why do you smoke? Because smoking is destroying your sensitivity. I said, you can't possibly know the truth if you're a living contradiction. If on one hand you're trying to culture sensitivity and self-control to be in touch with the truth, and at the other hand you're destroying your body and your ability to bring truth to, you can't possibly know it. Roughly speaking, sensitivity is consciousness to the states of manifest reality through the vehicles that we have that relate to those states. Very simple thing. Mystics claim that the universal spirit is sensitive to the macrocosmic worlds directly. It doesn't even need sense organs. It is so attuned and interpenetrated in the different worlds that it can perceive them directly. Now, we've already discussed sensitivity to the chemical region of the physical world through sense perception. Now let's begin to try to understand sensitivity and clairvoyance, progressively going through higher and higher realms as we go. It's going to be very slow. It's going to take us several days. Now, someone who is capable of being sensitive to what are called higher worlds has traditionally, for a long time, been called a sensitive. Even in some of our philosophical lessons we have here, we teach what a sensitive is. The easiest way to describe a sensitive is to do the opposite, and that is to describe someone who is not sensitive. A non-sensitive person is somebody who is very well adjusted to the material world. They can eat everything, they sleep soundly, they're not usually ill. The person is perceptive of things, but only of the things of this world and to worldly ends and usually personal ends. That kind of person is likely to be blunt, self-assertive, and relatively insensitive to the psychology of other people, except if it's pragmatic. It's such a person that the Beatles write about in one of their songs, a real nowhere man, nowhere going. Isn't he a lot like you and me? All of us are aware of such people, and even most of us, for quite a bit of our time, are like that. Now, that's a valuable state for most people to learn the basic fundamental things of this world and to garner the experience that we have to have here, and it's very good. It's kind of objectivity. People are anchored, they're stabilized, and they're insulated from experiences that they may not be able to handle. There's some faults to it. We can't get away with things. People who are completely insensitive to anything but the material world do try to get away with things, but for the most part, it is a healthy way of living. A person like that, coming to a talk like this, would be bored. They would think it was impractical and uninteresting, and on top of that, they would think that everything that was said here was crazy talk. It's exactly the words that you hear. One of the first indications of sensitivity is an interest and an awareness to something that is beyond the five senses. It's hard to put your finger on at first, but there are some things that your, so to speak, psychic antennae go out. People who are adjusted to the material world, they hear things like psychiatrists say in interpreting dreams or things like that, or they hear things from astrology, and they say it's all nonsensical. Well, it doesn't make any difference to them at all. We make a big mistake. A sensitive person can never prove spirituality to a person who is materially developed. But somehow, because we have the sensitivity and we have the intuition, we think if we talk long enough and if we're clear enough, we'll get it through. But it won't get through. No matter how clear an argument is, no matter how rational it is, if sensitivity is necessary to appreciate it, it isn't going to get anywhere. Now, one of the curious things about this, one that often raises a lot of objection in people, is that a sensitive person is more likely to suffer ill health. At first, this seems counterintuitive. It would seem much more logical that if we were living in a higher way, we would have better health because we were living by the higher principles. Now, in the long run, that's true. But right now, we're bumbling beginners, and we're between two worlds, and we're not well established in a way of life that appeals to both worlds. And until we are established in a way of life that takes into account both worlds, illness is a likelihood for somebody that is sensitive. Now, if you think about it, that in terms of divine justice, in terms of cause and consequence, that becomes meaningful. It becomes meaningful because we don't just get illnesses just because we've been exposed to a chill or something like that. We get illnesses because we have a large backlog of unredeemed destiny. There are a lot of misdeeds, misfeelings, misthoughts that we have perpetrated that we have not objectively come to understand. And when the fruits of our misthinking and the fruits of our mismotivations or our incorrect actions become manifest in the material world in our physical body, it is indubitable. When you're sick, you know you're sick. If you've got a weak heart, you know you have a weak heart. And so when you're sensitive and the connection between the inner and outer bodies is different than it is in a normal person, you're more likely to illness, and that is good. Because, as we've been saying, the subject has to be purified, the subject has to have soul power, and that is garnered by learning to live the truth. The physical world and the physical body is our proving ground. And when we have a number of illnesses, it proves to us very quickly that we're not thinking well or that we're not emoting correctly. I've had several major illnesses in life. a life-threatening illness, and it changed my thinking a lot. And my health is better now than it ever was before that, primarily because I don't indulge myself in that false kind of thinking that I was living by before. In the long run, probably after several incarnations, when we are so established in spiritual truth and in the truth of all the realms, and we have complete control of all of our thoughts and the desires that come out of them and the actions that we take and the experiences in the material world, then we will probably have never any illnesses again, whether we are sensitive or whether we are not. So the illnesses turn out to be beneficial things to us because through them we correct ourselves, and through them we get the soul power, and through them we cleanse ourselves so that we are not looking through imperfect vehicles. Now there are many degrees of sensitivity. Everything in the spiritual world is a matter of degree, not of quantity, but of degree. And let's explore some of them a little bit for a little while. We'll just begin with this today and we'll continue tomorrow. The lowest degree of being a sensitive can be recognized or established quite easily. A sensitive sees the world differently and sees the world in terms that are beyond the material. A sensitive has a more subtle awareness and is more tuned in, especially to intuition. They have more aspirations and hunches. They're called dreamers, but they're actually in touch more with the inspirational stuff that is behind the dreams that we all have. We've already mentioned that a sensitive has a greater likelihood of illness, and a sensitive can tune in to talks like this or to more spiritual things. We may be more tuned in to our dreams and our aspirations, but we may not be correct about them. So the attunement is an ongoing process. We're ever more subtle. A musician who is a very, very developed musician, the tuning of an instrument becomes more and more critical. I'm sure that you've seen, especially guitar players are like that. They're very good guitar players. They'll play a tune and then it'll sound fine to you, and then they'll start that tedious tuning process, and they'll keep working at it and working at it until they get to perfection. For somebody who is already a clairvoyant, the simplest degree of sensitivity is a matter of observation, and it isn't a matter of conjecture. We're looking indirectly. For someone who is sensitive, another clairvoyant can see that person because at the first degree of sensitivity, there is a loose connection between the etheric vital body and the dense physical body. They're loose. They can be dissociated from material anchoring, and that looseness makes for a sensitivity that they can put their attention more into the etheric realm. Normally, people are deeply invested in the physical body, and that's all they have, and they hang on to it for dear life. Now, this simple degree of sensitivity can occur in several different ways, and some of those ways have to do with evolution. Some people have a loose connection between the etheric body and the physical body because they have not yet completely involved in the physical body. They're not in the physical body in the same way that a workaday person is. Animals have this sensitivity. Animals have inner world sensitivity, all of them have it to some degree. And for that very reason, the spirit is completely individuated, and it is completely in the vehicles, and the vehicles, higher vehicles, are not completely in the physical body. Now, there are also a large number of humans that have been reticent about coming into the material world. And it's easy to see why they are reticent, because they still have a sense of some of the glory of the spiritual world. And they know that if they come fully into their body, they're going to lose that awareness, and they're reluctant to do that. They are what might be called involutionary sensitives. They are still evolving. You can usually spot such an individual because they don't have a lack. They have a lack of understanding and of appreciation of the material world. They're very often associated with philosophies that eschew the physical world. They have a distaste for being physical beings. Now, this is really interesting. It's terrible to generalize, and I don't want to generalize totally, but there are a large class of people that live in the United States that have this kind of involutionary sensitivity, which is not of benefit to their evolution. We have a work to do here. We have something to become, and the only way we can become what it was divinely intended for us to become, and which we agreed to become, is if we follow through on our work. So the Lords of Destiny find out that people who have an involutionary sensitivity are often easily addicted to alcohol. And what alcohol does is it shuts off that sensitivity. So there are times that even such a thing as addiction, and even if it makes a miserable life, the nation of Canada has to deal with this a lot, because the Native Americans are very inclined to have a nature involutionary sensitivity, and they don't see the purpose of the technical world or anything like that. The casinos are helping that, but they find themselves not having something to do, and yet they don't live in a world that they can use that involutionary sensitivity to work with nature as they used to. The old philosophy is gone, the old relation to the world is gone, and so they find themselves unmotivated to be material at all. And do you know that, like in places in northeast Arizona, there are alcoholics at age 10. And if they can't get regular alcohol, they'll drink Sterno. I was traveling a few years back, and I met a couple of guys who were just dandy guys. It was quite an experience, because one was they were motorcyclists, and I was riding a motorcycle, not at that moment, but I was at that time when I was riding motorcycles. And I started talking to them about motorcycles, and eventually we got talking about things, and they were Edward Albee evolutionists. They read all those books by Edward Albee, and about the canyons and all, and they were on break, and they were teachers. And the one that was real tough, looked big, and a big beard, and those little green glasses like you see in spy movies and things like that. And at first I was reluctant to talk to them, because they look like people you don't want to mess with these people at all. And they turned out to be sweethearts. That guy had gone and lived in a commune in Finland for a while. And they were, from the goodness of their heart, they were working with the kids on the Indian reservations. And they said, it's just sad. It's really, really sad, because the kids have no purpose in life, because, they start drinking alcohol at that age. And then some of their own people become suppliers. They run to the Mexican border and they get cheap alcohol and bring it back. And they don't sell alcohol on the reservations, but they bootleg it all in. So even if there is this kind of clairvoyance, if this kind of destructive activity for a life or two, It's important. It shuts off clairvoyance. But it's one of those things, if you go too far, it does just the opposite. Because if you have, like for example, one of the greatest seers in the 20th century felt that he still had hereditary clairvoyance. We're talking of Dr. Rudolf Steiner, who was an amazing clairvoyant, and he felt he had evolutionary clairvoyance, and he thought that as a Christian mystic, that the way you did it is you followed what Christ set down. And the first act of Christ in the Gospel of St. John, and all of those that are inclined toward Rosicrucian kinds of things, follow the Gospel of St. John. The first act of Christ, the first miraculous act, was to turn water to wine. And in all of the mysteries, this period of involution into matter has two cups, just like John's Gospel does. There is the cup of wine, which is the cup of forgetfulness of the spiritual worlds, and then there's the cup of water at the Last Supper, where you say, "This do in remembrance of me," when you remember back into the spiritual worlds. So for a period of several weeks, he took wine and drank himself to intoxication every day until he was absolutely certain that he had no vestige of involuntary or hereditary involutionary clairvoyance from his ancestors in his bloodstream. After that, he never drank another drop of alcohol again. It changes the bloodstream. But the peculiar thing is, if you drink too much alcohol and you continue to do so, it forces another kind of clairvoyance on you. One of the most hideous kinds of clairvoyance that you can imagine in the lower desire world. Delirium tremens. It's that kind of a thing. All right, we're just about done here. Yeah, I'll just right at the very end. The kind of sensitivity that we are likely to and that we are working on is, to some extent, we have graduated from the material world. We appreciate the material world. We understand it's a rational place, and it has a purpose. We're grateful for the opportunity to be here, but it isn't enough for us. It's just not enough. We need something more. And so we become people who have a lot of wonder, and we're looking always for that meaning, always for that spiritual purpose that is just a little beyond. The evolutionary or evolutionary sensitive, people like ourselves, you can always tell them because they have that feeling of awe. Little things awaken inspiration and a care for something higher. Sometimes, however, we are a little world worry. There's only so much of the material world that we can handle. And usually people that are evolutionary clairvoyants are people who have talents and abilities at science and the arts, and they have some remarkable ability to catch on to, that indicates that they have an experience of the world, that they have soul power, that they relate to stuff and they know what it is. All right, we'll stop there for today, and we'll continue on tomorrow, and we'll start getting into what most people will find more exciting journeys into the inner world. Your question?
One of the ones is this psychological actively about the voluntary?
Yes. Not so much in pure involutionary sensitivity, but there are other ways that sensitivity is produced where people by their psychological abnormalities will probably be covering that. That people, for example, who have enormous fears of one kind or another, they produce a dissociation from the physical world. They withdraw, and they sometimes do it so shockingly and so regularly that they have a sensitivity also. And then their clairvoyance is atavistic, and it's almost like an animal, that they can sense things that are dangerous or that are a peril. And almost all people that have severe psychological difficulties have a degree of sensitivity and some kind of involuntary clairvoyant or clairaudient experience, hearing voices and things like that are part of the, and it's because of withdrawal. Okay, next one.
You spoke earlier of the an entity can't enter into a physical form unless they have a physical body.
Yes, they can enter into it. They can grab somebody else's, but they, like this whole idea that there are beings from all over in space that come here and become physical is in most cases very highly unlikely. Because unless they have gone through an evolution like ours that relates to this kind of material world, they can't build this kind of body. And if they could be in this kind of body, they really couldn't know it for what it was. There is the case of Caspar Hauser. Caspar Hauser was a man that was raised in a cellar. He supposedly was somebody that each of the children of Adam and Eve represent a part of humanity. Seth represents the Son of Man, the child of Adam and Eve, and he represents the part of humanity that approaches life by faith. Cain represents the part of humanity that Cain is the child of, not of Adam and of Eve, but of Eve and the Lucifer spirit Samael, according to the myth. And the children of fire, or the people who have to change the world by creative means, are then the children of Cain. Abel, who was slain, represents the part of humanity that never fell. Some never fell, and they never come into this material world because they didn't need to. They were what we were like had we not sinned. No, they are like Caspar Hauser. They can function in the ethers extremely well, but can't understand the physical world. They come into incarnation supposedly every time that someone who is pure and nobody has any hots on. They're usually born with a myth of somebody who is pure from any kind of sin. Caspar Hauser was one of the last of the Napoleonic line. And supposedly, I can't answer to things like this, the intent was that he was going to be a ringer, that they were going to bring him in and he was going to incarnate, and he was going to be the one that would unify Europe from all the different languages and cultures and things like that, because he wasn't aligned with anyone. The dark forces got a hold of him, and he was raised in a cellar until he was about 14 years old. And he was so sensitive that in the daytime he could see stars. And he had the Lemurian consciousness of memory. You could show him a phone book, and he could tell you every name. They did it at parties with him. 200 or 300 people would come into the hall, and they'd shake hands and give him their name, and on the way out he would say their name back to each one of them. But he couldn't understand, because he didn't understand the material world, he couldn't understand how people could build a building that was bigger than them, because he had no experience of that. And so if there were someone with an alien consciousness, even a human-like being that had no experience of the material world, they'd have a hard time with it. He did learn to do some things like play piano and things like that, but it was with great effort and great assertion. There was a movie made. It was a movie, so it's fictionalized to some extent, but Werner Herzog, the famous German movie maker, did a movie called Caspar Hauser. There's also there are several books called Caspar Hauser, the Wonder Man of Europe, and they're worthwhile books to get. So yes, it's possible for other beings to come into a human body, but they have to work through the inductive consciousness of a human in order to appreciate and be able to work in this world. Yes. No, it's not at all. It's the same thing. He had to learn, and he had to be helped by mystics in order to be able to adapt to the physical body and to keep the physical body together at all. There was a great time because the spiritual forces were working so strong in him, and the spiritual forces tend to universalize that there was great danger of disintegrating the physical body while he was in it. This is why within 3 days the whole physical body of Jesus disintegrated. It was gone. None of this stuff that it was preserved with herbs and it's in a cave somewhere in India or in Afghanistan. That's just not it. It disintegrated. It was gone. He had a hard time keeping it together. The incarnation by Christ in